Are they ready?
You're good to go.
Okay. Good afternoon. I'm Claude Barfield, a senior fellow, very senior, at the American Enterprise Institute, and I'd like to welcome this kind of corporal's guard to our session, our panel discussion on digital trade rules in the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. As we were talking before, I thought there was not much chance, but it could be that it was said that this was quite timely because there was a fifth meeting of the Indo-Pacific negotiating groups, or the 14 nations, a few days ago in Bangkok. But as with other meetings, there was no real announcement. The IPEF, as it's called, as many, I suspect most of you in this room know, was launched in 2021. There have been 5 meetings, as I say, and there will be another one in mid-October. The administration has announced, though I think there's no form, it's just the administration announcement over time, that it wanted to finish the negotiations by the APEC meetings in San Francisco, which come in November. Right now, the only published text that I think we've had has to do with the security questions in terms of supply chains. The other pillar, there are 4 pillars, as again, I'll be quick because I suspect everybody knows this. One on environment and climate. The trade pillar, and then the, let's see, what's the 4th pillar? Supply chains, labor, environment, good government, and taxes, and trade. So there have been rumors for months that the trade negotiations, such as they are, we can talk about whether this is a negotiation or not, have lagged behind the other pillars. We'll have to see. I think there is skepticism now, increasingly, as there has been, I think, for some months, that the administration actually will be able to put together a complete package. They certainly, I would guess, refer to my other panelists here, will certainly try to announce something at the APEC meeting to save face. But it doesn't look like it's going to be very complete. This excellent panel that we have today is well prepared to talk about the nitty-gritty of what is being discussed and debated, and in some cases there's conflict over the terms of the digital trade portion of the trade rules portion of the trade pillar. But I thought we would also try to broaden it a bit. And so I've asked one of the panelists, I'll introduce the panelists in a minute, to take a look at the digital trade rules in the IPEF in terms of the larger questions, the larger policies that have been put forward for trade by the Biden administration. The Biden administration has announced or said from the very beginning that it was going to change the approach to trade that previous administrations, both Democrat and Republican, had adopted, and was going to adopt and going to put forward a so-called worker-centric trade policy. It'd be interesting to see how this fits in terms of digital trade rules. It's not clear, but the administration will, I think, make that clear when and if they get something in the IPEF. I should say that just a couple of weeks ago, Catherine Tai, the U.S. Trade Representative, reaffirmed that this was something this was something they were very serious about. I think she said the worker-centric policies are not a flash in the pan. This is something we will go forward with. On the other end, beyond just the specifics of what is being discussed in the negotiations and have been discussed in other trade agreements around Asia, in earlier trade agreements by the United States, the issue has gotten all mixed up in the attempt, or so-called attempt, to rein in big tech in the United States, and the attempt actually to change antitrust rules that have been in place for decades. And this has been raised as, that is, the potential language that could be put forward in the IPEF has been raised as a potential of hampering the US government if it wants to move forward in policies related to big tech. So that is kind of the framework. I'll ask the panelists, each of the three panelists, to open with an opening statement, and then I'll go around with them if there's anything they want to add in terms of what they've heard, and then maybe a couple of questions from me, and then we'll turn to the audience. The first speaker, who is here somewhere on Zoom, is Joshua Meltzer, who is a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. And Josh has written on trade issues for a long time. He has actually just co-authored a paper with an AEI colleague, Nina Chennai, which I think is quite good, actually, on US-China trade policy. We then have to my right Nigel Corey, who is Associate Director for Trade Policy at the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation, who has also spent a good deal of time on digital trade issues. And finally, there's Sean Heather, who is the Senior Vice President for International Regulatory Affairs and Antitrust at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. So, Josh, if you're here, shall we get started? Or if you're not here, we can go ahead to Nigel and then back up.
I'm here.
You're here, okay.
He's here on this screen. I don't know if we can get him down here.
Oh, he's on that, I'm sorry, I couldn't see it on this. Sorry, Josh, I couldn't see it.
No, all good.
Please, get started.
Claude,
thank you for being here.
Yeah, no, pleasure. Thank you for the invitation. And you've got a 50% Australian panel, so congratulations on that diversity pick there as well. What I thought I just, it might be just helpful to kickstart the conversation, because I know Nigel, and we'll certainly have a lot to say about and where the current state of play is on IPEF, just to give a bit of run through some of what's led up to this moment and where the US has been on digital trade, set the scene a little. Because if you go back to, it's even worth level setting and just sort of reflecting on why this matters so much, not only for the US, sort of as a global sort of phenomena in terms of trade priorities, trade everywhere, and not to sort of run through what is well understood ground now, but essentially what we see is that increasing amounts of trade are being conducted online, right? And so this can be on e-commerce platforms. We know that a lot of services are increasingly traded digitally. Global value chains require sort of digital interconnectivity to operate effectively. A lot of digital technologies like data analysis and now artificial intelligence, is being brought online as a service through cloud computing devices, APIs, and that requires access to the internet. It requires free flow of data. So it's we're talking about sort of the trade policy facing part of a broader transformation that's been happening economically, globally, and looking to develop new rules to reflect that reality. And at the same time that this has been happening, we've been seeing a lot of data, restrictions being implemented globally, a lot in Asia certainly, but this is a global phenomena, often around, goals that a lot of governments want to pursue, like protecting privacy or getting at cybersecurity issues. Some of them have been more what we would sort of identify as just, sheer protectionism, protecting sort of, domestic companies from competition and so forth. And others have been more controversial in areas of sort of censorship and control and access onto online information. So it's a complex sort of suite of drivers, I think, that are pushing governments to sort of intervene in the data space and in the digital space. And so it's been a real challenge to get at a set of rules that can ultimately get at the opportunities from digital trade, from data flows, but also providing the space for governments to essentially intervene in ways that they think are legitimate to pursue other goals. And, framed this way, I think for anyone who's spent time in the trade space is not an unfamiliar framing, right? Trade rules have always been trying to balance between commitments to non-discrimination in particular, also giving space for governments to pursue other legitimate regulatory goals. And we see that framing that took place in the WTO and in the goods and services space sort of carried through with some changes, though, into the digital space. But the US was certainly the first to sort of lead out on this just as an issue. And, you need to go back to CORUS, the Korea-US trade agreement in I actually am blanking on the date when this actually came into effect, 2012 maybe, but effectively when there was a sort of a non-binding auditory commitment to cross-border data flows, which is the first time we ever saw that. But then that quickly sort of turned into a more full-fledged set of digital trade commitments that was first, unveiled in the TPP, which, we know the sorry saga of that agreement. But the CPTPP ultimately, which obviously didn't include the US, I think was really the firstly fully fledged sort of set of new digital trade commitments. And there's a lot in there. And in many respects, that's still, I think, the building block of where everything else has gone from there. And, the key innovation, a commitment to cross-border data flows, commitments to no data localization, no access to source code as a condition of trade, all subject to sort of GATS Article 14 style exceptions. But other more also very important in the weeds stuff around e-commerce and digital documentation and recognition of e-signatures. In some areas, making permanent the moratorium on customs duties for electronic transactions, getting also into some of the more regulatory areas around privacy and cybersecurity. And you look sort of down the road and even some of the more cutting edge issues around artificial intelligence are starting to crop up. And the US sort of took TPP, put it into USMCA and then added it, tightened it up really a little. So that was actually probably a stronger digital trade chapter than what we saw there. And I think that's the last time the US at least did an FTA with a sort of comprehensive set of digital trade commitments. And then in parallel with so-called digital economy agreements, which are notably different from FTAs in that they're focused really just on rules for the digital economy. They don't tend to include market access. But these have proliferated as well. The US has been party to some of them, such as with Japan. There are others like the Digital Economy Partnership Agreement and elsewhere in the region that have also developed. I think interesting when thinking about the broader kind of importance of this for the US, there's always now, particularly with respect to China, a geopolitical sort of lens to all of this. And so this, I think, is always a little true, but, very much so that the US vision for an open kind of internet that was sort of non-discriminatory, was interoperable and so forth, was also something that was being reflected and carried through in these free trade agreements and digital economy agreements. And that, having said that, though, China has, through the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, which includes digital, I think it's called an e-commerce chapter rather than digital trade chapter, but has essentially signed up to a range of commitments that, on first glance look pretty good in that they do include a commitment to data-free flows and et cetera. But when you sort of, upon a close reading, you see that where the rubber hits the road is in the scope of the exceptions provision, and this gets a little back to what I was saying earlier, which is the balancing that these rules are trying to strike between giving, maximising the upsides, the free flow, the digital trade, and providing scope for governments to deviate is really being hammered now, less so in the commitment to, data flows per se, but in the exceptions provision and how big and broad and flexible that goes. And the RCEP one is pretty flexible. It's a lot more than the typical GATS Article 14 type exception. It's much closer to sort of a national security style, sort of self-determining exception. And so in many respects, it undermines, I think, I think from a US and sort of perspective, a lot of the benefits that you get from these types of commitments. But that framing, I think, is really important, and how that plays out, in free trade agreements, how that might play out in the WTO, where there's a joint initiative on e-commerce, and these are still very much outstanding issues there. Will set some of the rules and the frameworks of how governments sort of balance between the opportunity piece and the intervention piece. And I think this is where US leadership ongoing US leadership will be essential to make sure that the balance gets set in an appropriate way. And that, I think, probably allows me to stop and hand it over to whoever's next to carry the conversation forward.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to turn to Nigel, but I want to warn you that I'm going to come back and push you a little bit on the politics of trade in this administration, because there has been, it's been noted, and not just rumors, but have been reported, that there are divisions within the administration, which goes back, I think, to the so-called Democratic coalition, which you might have something just as bad under an earlier Trump administration, or you might have one if Trump is president again. But they are intrinsic, it seems to me, characteristics and pressures that the U.S. Trade Representative under Biden has that we have not seen, I think, before. But I'll come back to that, Josh. Nigel?
All right,
Thank you.
Thanks, Claude. Appreciate the opportunity to be here at AEI with other distinguished panellists whose work and I follow and read the news. It's great to be here to talk about IPEF because we're in possibly the final stages in terms of what the Biden administration has laid out in terms of delivering something by the APEC leaders meeting in November. But unfortunately on digital trade, progress has been problematic and frustrating for US trade partners especially as they wait for the US to finally catch up to where they are, having left them in the TPP and having long since moved on from the type of misguided domestic debate that is throwing US digital trade policy off course here. Just how far US digital trade policy is thrown off is yet to be seen, obviously. The proof is in the pudding. But in that regards, we have clear benchmarks to compare and contrast it against whatever it is that we see come November or later in terms of the CPTPP, these digital economy agreements that Josh mentioned, as well as, most importantly, USMCA. And so it'll be very easy for us to compare and contrast to see how it measures up and what I suspect how much weaker IPEF's digital trade provisions will be vis-a-vis USMCA. The problem is that USTR-TIE has not actually demonstrated in clear and practical terms what a worker-centric digital trade agenda actually is in practice. So it's still largely a guessing game, but we certainly have an idea given her ideological opposition to quote-unquote big tech, as you mentioned, Claude, and how this aligns with other broader progressive attacks on digital trade. Earlier this year, we heard all text in the digital trade chapter was essentially frozen due to increasing progressive political attacks against the Biden's administration's digital trade agenda. And so that obviously disrupted negotiations and it took some time for this text to be unfrozen. But even at that stage, not all texts had been tabled, and we're in the final stages of these negotiations, and so you'd think that at least everyone knows exactly what they're talking about, but that wasn't the case, and that there were missing provisions on source code and algorithms and cybersecurity. And I'll just run through these examples as well as what I understand the nature of the debate is around data flows to give you an idea of how the USTR-TIE is potentially viewing digital trade commitments in IPEF. But basically, there's a theory of how algorithms can facilitate collusive behaviour, namely price fixing, but that these concerns are pretty misguided and that such sort of regulatory legal scrutiny would fall within the common exception provided for governments to request access to source code and algorithms as a part of court proceedings and such. And so this concern about countries making commitments on source codes and algorithms is a red herring. And I mean, it's ironic given it was the United States that was pushing for these types of protections, given policies in countries like China that were forcing US firms to hand over access to source code as a condition of market access. So we've gone upside down here in terms of US digital trade policy. What is perhaps even more troubling is that the digital products rule is being seen as implicating competition policy objectives here in the United States by the Biden administration, and that they think it may need to be revised. When all this digital product rule is in terms of like treating physical and digital products sort of the same and fairly, regardless of who provides it, all it does is demonstrate the central principle of non-discrimination to the world in the global trading system. So the fact we've been able to live with this principle for 70 odd years in physical goods, that somehow we need to change it for digital goods is, I find, highly sort of not persuasive. And so, but the fact that that's even in question gives you an idea of how far this skepticism from the Biden administration has gone into re-examining what have long been like non-controversial components of trade agreements. As it relates to data flows and data localization, which is when countries force firms to store data only within its borders, it's a spreading tactic, it's a protectionist tactic, it's highly discriminatory against foreign firms who tend to rely on centralised IT systems. But what we've seen is that USMCA had strong commitments, enforceable commitments on data flows and provisions prohibiting data localization. But we've seen arguments that against essentially making such strong binding commitments on data flows and IPEF because some folks worry that companies can somehow bypass US laws by simply transferring data overseas, and that digital trade provisions thus sort of impede the enforcement of US law, which is completely not true. If a firm has legal nexus in the United States, then they are subject to its laws, and regardless of where data goes, they will be held accountable to it, which has been made clear through FTC decisions and court decisions and such for however long. And so what this shows is that these progressive opponents of digital trade misunderstand that the confidentiality of data does not depend on where it's stored. It only depends on the measures used to store it securely. Finishing up and tying back to something Josh mentioned, the situation we're at in terms of the US's usual role leading the discussion on new digital trade and digital economy agenda rules is even more pressing than IPEF, in that parties at the WTO Joint Statement Initiative on E-commerce are getting towards the point where they're talking about the most controversial issues such as data, and the US is not really at the table. And other US trading partners are trying to figure out how do we square the circle on this with Europe. But before they can even get to concerns about how Europe addresses this issue, they are left wondering where the US stands. And so the position that the USTR tie has put us in is very strategically problematic. It's not just the Indo-Pacific, it's global. But I suppose, and just in conclusion, sort of what this sort of dovetails into, these concerns about how long-standing trade law and digital trade rules have applied here, in the notion of that these USTR tie and others think that they're somehow going to impede their efforts to enact competition and other policies, is simply just not proven in fact, in that we have Canada, New Zealand, Singapore, Japan, Australia and others who have long-standing, have long pursued new digital trade rules, and none of these have prevented them from enacting new laws and regulations on competition, cybersecurity, data privacy, content, intellectual property, whatever it may be. And so it just shows that these attacks against digital trade are really based on sort of misguided understanding of how these rules operate, and more broadly reflect sort of a broader agenda in terms of wanting to rein in and attack quote-unquote big tech. So with that, I'll end it there.
Thank you. I'll come back, one question later I'll come back to, and that is, could this be, if not fixed, at least a gesture in the direction of what is an ill-conceived, I understand, notion of the language about the public exception? We'll come back to that later, I think, to see whether or not there's some wiggle room there. It's general language, and I guess it's depending on what obviously the progressives are looking at it one way, others looking at it another way. But it's general enough so that one could make a case, I think, but I defer to you, and we can talk about it when we come back, for either side here, that it's not really a big exception, or it is a big exception. Anyway, excuse me, Sean?
Let me add my thanks to you, Claude, and AEI for having us.
Thank you for coming.
And always good to be with Josh. It's been a little while, sir, and with you, Nigel. I thought I would actually try to pull us back a little bit and maybe talk a little bit about how I think we got here. And in trying to figure out what I would say today, I realized that this was an opportunity to talk about me. That doesn't usually happen on a panel. And what do I mean by talking about me? 15 years ago at the Chamber, circa 2007, the Chamber decided to create the Center for Global Regulatory Cooperation. And why did we do that? Well, we had a number of members who said, look, the trade agenda was all about, opening markets. And markets today are relatively open. I don't have my statistics like I did back then, but coming out of World War II, the average tariff amongst industrialized nations was something like 40%. In 2007, the average tariff amongst industrialized nations was just a couple of percent. The issue with trade was really regulatory and competition-related issues. And trade agreements hadn't really addressed regulation and competition issues. And going forward, trade agreements were going to have to figure out how to tackle those issues, because those were the pain points for doing business. You could do business around the world, but your ability to compete in markets was being driven by regulatory conversations where either there was friction between regulatory regimes or the inherent nature of governments to continue to be protectionist have been driven out of tariffs and at the border barriers, and now we're finding their way into regulatory design. So we created this thing called the Center for Global Regulatory Cooperation, and our tagline is, how do you align trade, regulatory, and competition policy in support of open and competitive markets? These are three distinct pillars within governments. You have trade policy experts, you have regulatory experts, and you have competition experts. And if you maximize all three in the direction of open and competitive markets, you will have a more liberal economic system that we will all benefit from. When you have misalignment in those things, you will not. So I find myself 15 years later in a moment in time where the other side, you keep calling them progressives, I would say that they are part of this neo-Brandeisian movement, which is coming out of antitrust circles, where they too are talking about aligning trade, regulatory, and competition policy. But they aren't interested in aligning it in support of open and competitive markets. They're interested in aligning it in an effort to achieve fair markets. What is fair? Most of what government historically has thought about doing is addressing what is unfair. And fair and unfair are not opposites. Things that are unfair, I think people can get concrete definitions and terms around. But when you all of a sudden open the conversation to what is fair, you have the ability to project lots of different views into that. So to tie this together with the conversation that we have today and what's happening in IPEF and these digital rules, and what's happening domestically on antitrust and happening around the world on kind of competition policy related matters. It's not just about big tech. That's my first point. While the domestic competition agenda has put a focus on big tech, it has put a broader focus on big being bad. US antitrust policy has always looked at two things as their kind of North Star. When we do antitrust in the United States, we say what happens to the consumer, not what happens to the competitor. And we also say that any business conduct in the market will have some pro-competitive benefits and some anti-competitive benefits or harms, and we will balance those two. And only where the harms exceed the benefits will there be action. These folks who now are trying to drive a new wave of thinking around competition policy are not interested in thinking about what's in the interest of the consumer. They're not interested in economic efficiency. They're not interested in a cost-benefit analysis between whether there are good outcomes from conduct and there's some harmful outcomes from conduct, and how do we balance that? They want to say what is fair. And when they look at what's happening in the trade world and these conversations about regulation, they look at what's happening, for example, in Europe with the DMA, where the DMA is not about competition. It's not about maximizing efficiency in the market. We can talk more about what this is, but it is essentially a special regulatory straitjacket that is being applied to just a handful of companies. And those companies predominantly are American. And if that is the direction that the neo-Brandeisians and others in the United States want to take competition policy, they want to make sure trade policy reflects that agenda. And this is why you've seen unprecedented actions by the FTC Chair Lina Khan and Jonathan Kanter at the DOJ to lean in and start whispering the direction of trade policy to Ambassador Tai. They have written communications that the Chamber actually blew the whistle on. They've refused to turn this letter over and make it public. There's all kinds of good backroom drama around the back and forth between the competition agencies and USTR. But the reason we got here, Claude, is that for 15 years, we've been talking about trade policy, but really been trying to figure out how to address kind of regulatory and competition concerns. That is what TPP was attempting to do. That's what USMCA, which grabbed the language on digital trade, has attempted to do. And now we have an administration who's quite frankly hostile to that agenda. And when you look at the competition conversations domestically, they're tying it into worker-centric as well. there's an interface between NLRB and the Department of Labor, and trying to say that, monopsony power in markets and things like non-competes and other things are antitrust problems, but it's tied to labor markets. So there is a nexus between these kind of worker-centric conversations that are happening in the trade space, what's happening domestically between competition and labor, and how all this impacts the conversation for today, which is IPEF and digital trade rules. So I thought I would try to provide a little bit of a bigger picture conversation, at least how we see it and how we got here.
Thank you very much. I have to say, as a historian, I have to say that the neo-Brandeisians, Louis Brandeis was counted as the ultimate progressive in his time. This is not the same as the progressives today. But I'd like to go back to Josh and anyone else, Nigel too, to talk a little bit more about the politics here and the current Democratic coalition, and how, we have a situation where, for instance, Catherine Tai, along with Lighthizer, I always thought, were the two driving forces put through the USMCA. They kept at it when there were people in the Trump administration that didn't think you could do it, and certainly people in Congress didn't think you could do it. But they did, and she presided over that. And now we have a change. And is it like she's responding to a change in the Democratic coalition that came after that? Or what is it that's behind this? It's not, I take Sean's point, but the politics, and trying to put this in the context of the changing politics of trade outside of, or that overlays the digital. And I should say, we should not forget, by the way, we've certainly in terms of what Sean was talking about, and even Nigel, we've talked about the Democratic coalition. But I wonder if some of the things you talked about, what Sean talked about, does not also resonate with Republicans, particularly Trump Republicans or Republicans in the House now. I don't know so much about the Senate, where I think we haven't had as much change as we think. But this is not just an issue. It is an issue that I think is more important to the Democratic Party, but it is not an issue that is certainly in terms, as I said, in terms of what Sean was talking about, that it is an issue that I think resonates with Republicans. Josh, why don't you pick it up, and then I'll turn to anyone else who wants to.
Sure. This is, I think, there's complicated drivers here. My take, on this from the beginning, and this is, I think, not. There's a specific digital trade piece, which I think, Sean outlined part of the way that there's a rethinking of antitrust approaches and how that might be reframing some of the thinking around the regulatory issues in the digital trade space as well. But I think this is also part of a broader, shift that's underway in terms of how the, this administration, but the past administration as well, are thinking about how they engage on trade policy. And, after the, if you look at, for me, the read has essentially been that the essentially the ability of I think Donald Trump to essentially win certain what were traditionally pretty strong Democrat states in 2016, partly on the back of white working class workers and demagoguing trade and blaming that and China on all of these sort of deindustrialization outcomes, changed potentially fundamentally the Republican position on trade. I think at least we don't know where the Republican Party will end up, right? It's clearly not the traditional sort of free trade supporting party that it was pre-Trump, and I think it's very unclear where it is going to end up. And so my read in part, at least, has always been that, the Biden administration was not prepared to expose themselves to that this time around. And I think as Trump gains in the polls and looks to be the likely nominee, that from a political strategic calculation seems to have been the right one, where, you see what's been happening with the UAW workers in Detroit and this battle over the union workers and so forth. And I think that trade policy has always been one of those areas that unions have never got behind, right? And they did for the first time ever with USMCA on the back of, some particular new provisions in that agreement. I think that the worker-centric trade policy and leaning into those elements, refusing to do new market access and so forth, I think from just a pure domestic political lens has sort of been, at least in part, I don't want to say that this has been the entire picture, but a strategic response to where the Republican Party went for those 4 years under Trump, and uncertainty about where the Republican Party is going. So I think that seems a part of what's going on. I think the other part, there is a genuine reassessment about where does the US want to commit its political capital when it comes to international economic engagement. And I think that it's looked a little disingenuous from the outside because it's been seen as politically expedient, in part in the way that I've outlined here. But and there's been a bit of sort of reverse engineering to explain the new approach. But it's not to say entirely without merit. I mean, there's been debate going on in Republican and Democratic circles for many years about whether the political capital that gets expended on further reductions in tariffs is worth it any longer, given where tariffs are, and whether tax policy or other areas really are where the focus should be. And so I think this is a debate playing out, and I think it's an important one to have. But that's for me a little of what's the sort of the lay of the land, at least.
Do you want to add anything?
Yeah, just building on what Josh said, I mean, we've all been here dealing with the changing nature of politics of trade here for over 10 years and how that has changed over time, and the focal points have changed, and trade has always been controversial to a degree, but the severity and its focal points have, I think, changed. And I was reminded of that in talking to some folks on the Hill who were questioning some of the commitments in IPEF on data and data flows and such. And I say, well, we've had this debate in depth for USMCA, and we landed, I think, somewhere really well on this. And they're like, oh, we want to reevaluate that again. Like we were paying attention to other parts of USMCA and weren't really focused on this. And so I think Sean did a fantastic job of conceptualizing the Biden administration's approach to trade and the shifting priorities there in vis-a-vis competition policy and fairness. And so I think we've seen a greater scrutiny applied to digital-related provisions, given how closely aligned they are with their overarching competition and antitrust concerns. And so provisions and issues that we thought were settled are not only back up for debate, but potentially up for major revisions. And this is all happening domestically while major close US trading partners have moved on. They are fine and settled with what has already been done, and they're looking to actually build on it through what Josh mentioned. These digital economy agreements are basically foundational new digital trade rules, but with new digital cooperation on top. And yet the US can't even really lock in those foundational elements yet before it can get to the cooperation side. So it's hard going, and I mean, I testified on the Hill yesterday on digital trade issues, and while there's still bipartisan support there, it's nowhere near as broad and wide as it used to be, and getting anything approved there is going to be much trickier than what it was in the past. But then the flip side, related to that though, and we were talking about this before we came in here, is the congressional role in the Biden administration's digital trade agenda in terms of how they position themselves to review and act on whatever we see come out of IPEF. So, which will be, I suppose, a more live example of the politics of digital trade coming up.
Just very quickly,
Go ahead.
I wouldn't disagree with what either of you have said, but I guess I would think that people are making a horrible miscalculation. I don't think the polling around asking Americans whether or not they believe the United States should be engaged in trade relationships around the world has changed significantly in the last 20 years. I mean, 96% of the world's consumers live outside the United States. We want to sell things to them. That is pro-worker. There is nothing else that one needs to think about beyond that. The question, I think, is that there is an effort underway to suggests that our trade policy somehow has been backwards and is part of the reason why lots of Americans feel like we're not as competitive as we once were. And somehow the blames for feeling as if you cannot find middle-class jobs or you cannot find the next hourly wage that is worth your labor is somehow because of trade. And that is not true. And there's this kind of dichotomy, I think, within voters where on one hand, they get it. There's 96% of the world out there that we want to sell things to. I think they get it that we have to, as an economy, be competitive, and we are not. And trade is not necessarily the problem associated with how to solve for all of that. And then when you talk about digital rules, when we are the most competitive economy in the world when it comes to tech, and the future of economic growth is going to be driven because of tech, and the United States is not out there leading the way, directing the rules for how tech will be deployed from an economic trading perspective, that only will cause people ultimately in the next 10 to 15 to 20 years to realize their greatest fear, which is we're losing our edge competitively. So I don't disagree with what either of you said about kind of the way things are being thought about, but I think it's all backwards because the polling has been consistent. People understand that 96% of the world lives outside the United States and we want to sell them something. People understand that digital is the future. Those two things should not be at odds with each other, and this administration and their approach is putting them at odds with each other.
I think that's right, and but I don't have on the top of my head. As you know, Gallup has polled on trade for decades, and I think the latest. It's true that in the last decade, the Republicans, self-identified Republicans, went down in terms of support of trade or trade agreements. A lot of this depends on how the question is asked, but now it's back up a bit to almost even. And I think ironically or interestingly, if you polled Democratic, self-identified Democratic voters, they're very strongly in favor or think that it's a plus for the United States. But to go back for the moment to go beyond to go back in terms of the broader picture and go a little bit beyond the digital, what is, given the situation, and I know I'm asking a question that we don't know probably because we don't know what's going on inside, but outside of digital, what is the administration, from what we know, pushing for in terms of the IPEF, in terms of other trade? What are they looking for in trade? Do we know anything about that? In terms of, they have a trade pillar, and Catherine Tai is presiding over that. Are they is there anything, given the pressures that they're under, that they can, as far as you could guess, what they're thinking? We may not know. I may be asking a question that we don't know, but there is a trade pillar, and I know we want to spend most of our time on the digital.
There is a trade pillar. I don't know what IPEF is. I know what it isn't. And I take them for their word when they say IPEF is not a trade agreement. So when we keep talking about the trade pillar and they keep saying it's not a trade agreement, I know what IPEF isn't, but I still don't know what IPEF is. And trade agreements are intended to create rules around all kinds of different conversations, standards, sanitary, phytosanitary related matters. You have issues on financial services. You have chapters on express delivery. You have all these different kind of moving pieces in the architecture of a trade agreement. Some of those pieces there are negotiating tables for in IPEF. I think there's lots of other chapters, if we even use the word chapters, because again, these are words we use for trade agreements, but this is not a trade agreement, we keep being told. That there are other ways we understand that the commitments that the U.S. is seeking are beneath the standard within USMCA. I'm not aware of any space in the trade negotiation pillar of IPEF, which again is not a trade negotiation, where they are continuing the path that USMCA set and have done only things that undermine what that standard was. So I don't know how else to answer your question, Claude, than to say, if Ambassador Tai was here, she would remind you that this is not a trade agreement. She has reminded the business community of that time and time again. They've structured it with different negotiations that look like chapters in trade agreements. What we understand is the text in those does not follow the USMCA script. USMCA was bipartisanly supported. Congress is not part of this conversation in any real meaningful way. And I think we're all going to find out what comes out in November.
And then also find out what this actually means in the longer term, because it's not a trade agreement. So what does it actually mean in terms of enforceability, in terms of holding these countries to account to whatever it is they've agreed on? It's a compounding mystery.
That brings me, I mean, this is a question for AEI myself, is that, why are we, this is not a trade agreement. There are challenges back and forth about whether an executive agreement would be enforceable in some way. But does it make any difference? Just talk about the digital. What we do or do not do in the digital, it's not going to be, given the fact that it's not enforceable, we don't know what it is. Why? It's a good question. Why am I having this session? Is this something we should just ignore? Or will the fact that the United States is perceived as having backed away from the USMCA rules be an important point down the road? Is that where we are in terms of the way we deal with this? Josh, go ahead. Josh, I can't see you, so I don't want to, from here I can anyway. Do you have any comment on this or what we've talked about?
Yeah, I do get concerned. I mean, even though it's not a trade agreement, I do get concerned when administration sort of walk back trade agreements and the level of commitments. I do think there's at a minimum, you have to remake the argument if you wanted to ratchet it up again. It's going to sort of have a precedent-setting effect. But it's not that governments can't change their mind and reevaluate. I think we have to see what comes out of this. I mean, on the one hand, we're caught between saying this agreement won't matter all that much. It's not a trade agreement. It's not going to be enforceable. Probably in the way that we talk about that in the trade context, and on the other hand, getting quite worked up about where they sort of land in this space. I'm not saying both positions aren't somewhat possible, but how significant US trade policy going forward, I think, is to be seen. Obviously, ultimately, in terms of what they do. I do want to just say, it's what I think is increasingly clear is that when you think about the trading system currently as it stands, grounded effectively still in the WTO and buttressed with other trade agreements that take other commitments further, what I think is clear is how possible arrangement is economically and politically when you have an enormous country like China pursuing an economic strategy that it currently does. I just think that the system has, it has been able to accommodate different development models and different approaches to international trade for a while. There was obviously a lot of challenges with Japan in the 1980s, and this is not about Japan becoming a bigger or smaller economy, but about the type of kind of subsidizing demand, suppressing approach that Japan had at times. But China is a quality challenge to the system, and it is, I think, not feasible to continue on the same pathway in an environment where China is what it currently is. And so, for me, this suggests that I don't think trade policy is. I think trade policy has always been important, but I really do think the main game in town is thinking about how do you operate in a global economy where you have the world's second largest, not only, and the fact is they will be increasingly reliant on external demand if they're going to sustain any reasonable rate of economic growth, but also has got no reasonable domestic demand to absorb trade from the rest of the world. Through various export policies, subsidies, and so on and so forth. I mean, this has been laid out by others clearly over many years. And China's not the only malactor in this regard. Germany has been running, huge trade surpluses, and so have other countries. And this all absorbed by the US as the largest deficit country around. And I think that this is increasingly unsustainable. So I think that, this, 2 points on that. Ultimately, I don't think about what trade policy is going to be like going forward by simply sort of saying that, we need to get back to sort of non-discrimination and MFN and lowering tariffs in this type of economic environment. I'm not sure what next, but I think the challenges are very significant, larger than they sometimes appear.
But I think there are two different, I'm just picking up on what I heard. I think there would be, and I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, I think there are two different things. If you talk about non-discrimination and tariffs, is one thing. When you get into the environment, you're getting into a much more complicated set of issues, it seems to me, as we see with what the Europeans are planning to do and what they're pushing the United States to do or whatever. So that gets you to those so-called new issues of which digital trade rules are one, that are much more complicated. And as I say, I want to go to some questions. I don't want to stay on this, but one point, I think in terms of what Nigel said, and I cut you off a little before we went to Josh, so if you want to pick that up. But we've talked about the internal disagreements in the United States, but even assuming that you had an administration now, whatever IPEF is, going forward with something like matching the USMCA, it's not clear to me that some of the nations, Indonesia, others, Vietnam, would actually agree to this, even in a regulatory or non-enforceable way. So it's not just our internal, it seems to me, and I'll throw this out, it's not just our internal disagreements among ourselves, it's also that and this is maybe different from the way things were under USMCA or under earlier trade negotiations, you're also getting pushback from countries who do not agree or are very nervous about what the United States got in the USMCA. I just throw that out.
Yeah, but I mean, that gets to your prior point of like, why are we here to talk about digital trade in the context of new trade agreements and economic cooperation? And I know like IPEF members wanted the US to use IPEF to advance the broad agenda about setting new rules on digital trade in the region, such that it didn't just cover like-minded countries like Australia, Singapore and Japan who have already committed to these agreements. They wanted to use IPEF to move the ball down the field and bring in some of those countries like Indonesia that haven't signed up to these rules that support a sort of an open, fair sort of trading system. But that would already have been a difficult task, but in the context of a non-trade agreement where there's not market access on the table and all of that, that task just gets that much harder because the Indonesians realise that the US is not really committed to this. It's not serious about actually holding their feet to the fire on this like the US and others did with Vietnam and TPP and CPTPP. So I get your point, like the challenge of convincing some of these newer countries to sign up to these new digital trade rules is significant, but it's only made harder when they can't see the clear, tangible, enforceable benefits through a broader agreement. And unfortunately, that's the recipe that other countries have been using and had hoped the US would use IPEF to use, but is obviously not where we are today. So in terms of the recipe analogy, like the proof is in the pudding, but in terms of where we see like Indonesia and others who haven't signed up, what they sign up to, if anything, on these trickier issues.
I have made the same mistake that a lot of people leading these things have done. I've gone beyond where I thought I was going to go in terms of asking for questions. So if there are any questions or comments from the people around the tables, and please, this is blinding to me, just raise your hand and wave it. And if my colleagues can see anything, let me know. So you agree with everything we said? No.
Well, while we see if we have a question, Josh made the point that kind of core to trade at the WTO is this idea of non-discrimination, which is often referred to as national treatment. That is under assault in this conversation. I mentioned earlier on this thing called the Digital Markets Act in Europe, where they have labeled 7 companies, all of which are foreign, 6 of which are American, have essentially said that those companies are so big that we're going to create special rules just for them. Perhaps they're unhappy that Apple runs an app store and they want to create rules specific for app developers in relationship to Apple and the App Store. Perhaps they're unhappy with Google and how it conducts search. Perhaps they're unhappy with Amazon and how small businesses access Amazon's e-commerce platform. All of those regulatory objectives are not a problem under trade rules. If you want to have a conversation about how to address small businesses' access to e-commerce platforms, you can have that conversation. You just can't write a rule that only applies to Amazon. There are more e-commerce platforms than Amazon in the world. And if it's good for small businesses with relationship to Amazon, why wouldn't it be good for small businesses for other e-commerce platforms? So all of the kinds of questions that are arising around big tech can happen without any interference from trade rules. But the problem is a trade rule says you can't just apply that regulation to certain actors and not others who are participating in that same market. And one of the direct assaults to the conversation in IPEF on digital trade rules is this idea that you have to ensure that you can discriminate in the way you regulate. This is what the neo-Brandeisian agenda is all about. This is what has always been about those people who don't like trade and want to undermine. And in some ways, I'm not sure the fight today is any different than it has been for the last 20 years, or 30 years, or 40 years. It just is being framed differently. But this idea that at the core of trade, we should protect national treatment is what is being attacked in these digital trade conversations.
Yep.
It's as simple as that.
One final question from the last couple of minutes. I take it, well, I'll just say this as a question. Do you think that the EU would sign up, if we were in negotiations, sign up to the USMCA rules on digital trade?
I think that there was a TTIP negotiation
Right.
that came between TPP and USMCA. I think that the European Union is, when I was involved in TTIP and these things, I said, like, look.
TTIP, by the way, is the Transatlantic Trade and Investment, which was rooted in the Obama administration. Excuse me for interrupting.
Correct, no, that's right. Look, the United States and the European Union's relationship is not a trade relationship. It's an investment relationship. There's trillions of dollars of European investment in the United States, and there's trillions of dollars of US investment in Europe. Because of those investments, we trade with each other. It's an investment relationship that drives trade, not trade that drives investment. The way I talked about TTIP was, because we're so deeply invested with each other, we've been living together but never decided to get married. And suddenly when we decided to get married after 50, 60 years of this deep investment relationship, we said, you know what? Marriage commitments don't fit us very well. We were expecting things that we thought would be easy for Europe to agree to. Europe thought that there would be things that we would be willing to talk about, and the whole thing kind of fell apart. I think Europe is never going to sign on to a US MCA or US TPP-led thing. Europe's going to want to have its own voice at the table, and it has less to do with what's on the piece of paper and more to do with personal pride and sovereignty and this, that, and the other. So I understand the premise of your question. I can't get around it.
I didn't know what people would say. I assumed that they would not be able to. But
right, but you could go through all the provisions in USMCA. I suspect that they would be comfortable with 75 to 80% of those. There would be 3 or 4 that they would want to, on the data flow issue, they'd want to say something that's a little bit more GDPR specific. They would have a couple other provisions in there that they would want to tweak this way, that, or the other. But I also don't know that Europe is that far off in many ways from where we are on these core objectives. They too have the same concerns that we have vis-a-vis China. They too have the same concerns that we have vis-a-vis what we're seeing in other markets. And increasingly, the European business community is waking up to the concerns that the American business community has been screaming about. And so could a deal be done? Yes. Would they sign on to the text as today? No. It's such a hypothetical question. I'm not sure it's
Thank you.
worth engaging.
Nigel or Josh, is there any final point you want to make?
I'll jump in quickly on
Please.
that piece. I mean, I think the EU relationship is potentially an interesting example of, how progress of a big, very important trading partner sort of outside the framework of a traditional trade agreement. I guess I remain unconvinced, I think, about the value ultimately of doing anything like, I think that a trade agreement with Europe, if we could actually ultimately, do it but if you look at the WTO, like at the end of the day, ultimately where this is where there were issues that just pushed up against, core European values, they just decided not to comply, right? We had that issue with beef and GMO and so on. And I think that we would constantly have that set of issues around technology as well, no matter what we ultimately agree to in a trade agreement. In a way, like if 2.5 years, one would argue that we've made a lot of progress transatlantically on a lot of issues by sort of building other mechanisms for dealing with trade disputes, for other mechanisms for enabling cooperation, and for sort of skirting around hot-button issues that wouldn't necessarily come up in a trade negotiation. And to Sean's point about the economic relationship, this is sort of a chicken and an egg question around, how much more are we going to do with each other or than we are doing already? Like what's the low-hanging fruit? What are we missing? I mean, there's clearly some industries that will do better if we had a trade agreement, but from a macro perspective, it's unclear to me like how much actual growth we would get and what the political kind of cost would be of trying to get that agreement done in the first place. I think it's an interesting time to sort of be thinking like outside the space of formal FTA. How do you build international economic cooperation with partners? And I think, it's not saying it's imperfect with the EU at the moment. The TTs, the Trade Technology Council may prove a bust and so forth, but we are arguably, making progress on issues that we haven't with Europe for a long time, at least in the technology. I mean, there's others which remain outstanding and so forth. I think it's part of what makes this kind of an interesting time to sort of question sort of how do we move forward some of these spaces if trade agreements are sort of just going to be deemed too hard. And I just want to addendum. I mean, I completely agree with Sean's point about the core need to sustain the non-discrimination law. I mean, I think that's absolutely essential, but it's got to be done essentially countries that are fundamentally working within some commonly agreed set of economic kind of principles. And I think this is what raveled principle when it comes to China and the WTO. And I think that what makes this whole thing very complicated.
Thank you. Nigel, do you want to?
Final point, 2 points, picking up where Josh left off, is China's role in all of this in terms of non-discrimination. Besides the US's lackluster engagement on data flows issues at the WTO JSI e-commerce, there's also the sheer uncertainty of would the US even sign up to an agreement that China's involved with. So that's another outstanding question. The second final point, also dovetailing off this Australian tag team effort we often find ourselves in with Josh, is thankfully I don't focus just on trade agreements, but I look at these new mechanisms for cooperation, the TTC, the Quad, the digital economy agreements, because new trade rules are no doubt still important and necessary, but they're no longer just sufficient when it comes to the issues raised by technology and data. But that requires a proactive, thoughtful approach by agencies, including trade agencies, about how they work with their counterparts and what domestic agencies they also need to bring along for the ride. I met with UK officials this morning. The UK, I think, is doing a lot of really new and interesting stuff like that, but I just have not seen USTR Thai sort of exhibit that type of creative thinking about even if you don't have a trade agreement, how you can also address these digital trade-related issues in a more concrete manner than what we're seeing there sort of lining up for IPEF.
Well, maybe we could just do without the USTR and turn this all over to the State Department and the Defense Department. That would, I don't want to end on that, but I will end on that. Please join me. This was better than I thought we could do in terms of the panel. Please join me in applauding a really good and solid and in-depth panel. Thank you, guys.
Thanks, Claude.
Thank you.